So today we're going to take a look at the Planning Commission. Your article today in the paper takes a deep look at some dysfunction, what the consequences of that dysfunction are. So usually we talk about what government bodies decide and what they discuss, but today we're going to talk about how the discussion is going and what that really means for the city. So let's start by just looking at who is on the commission and what role does this body play?
Yeah, well, a quick word about Planning Commission. There's nothing new about the fact that the Commission has a diversity of voices. It has in the past and it has now. The flavor of the conversations has changed a little bit, and I do think who's on the Commission has something to do with it, so it is worth going over.
Sure.
So the longest serving member is Michael Alchek, who you've probably been hearing about the most from the public and from some council members, and my story kind of deals with him probably more than other members. Mm-hmm. And he's a real estate attorney, and let's see, Shamak Gardias, he's the second longest serving member. He's an architect. Mm-hmm. And then some of the newer members are Susan Monk, who's also an attorney. Mm-hmm. Billy Riggs.
Vice chair, right?
She is the vice chair now. Yeah, Billy Riggs is the newest member, and mm-hmm. he's in transportation. I think he teaches and he's written papers on topics of transportation planning. Mm-hmm. The current chair is Ed Lowing, who mm-hmm. chaired Parks and Rec Commission, did it with great acclaim, unanimously reelected, and it seems like it was a very different situation there than it is at the Planning Commission.
I can imagine, yeah.
And Asher Waldfogel, who's a City Hall veteran because mm-hmm. of his work on the Utilities Advisory Commission before mm-hmm. he joined the Planning Commission, mm-hmm. and he served as vice chair last year. And
yeah, and he's a tech entrepreneur.
Yeah, he's a tech entrepreneur.
Several companies.
Yeah, and Doria Suma, last but not least. She's been there for the last year and a half or so, mm-hmm. and she's a longtime neighborhood activist in College Terrace and mm-hmm. worked on various commissions and committees, as a volunteer, with the Development Center and a few other things. Mm-hmm. So that's the membership. And
yeah. So in your article, you've been noticing over time, and you're not the only one, that there's some friction between the members. How long has this been going on, and what are some examples of what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, there's always been some friction in the commission for as long as I've been covering it. I mean, you can go back to when I started 10 years ago. We had kind of almost two factions, with mm-hmm. some of the slower growth people, like Arthur Keller, Susan Feinberg, and some of the more pro-growth people, like Daniel Garber, Samir Tuma. So we always had this kind of friction that was more ideological and kind of way you view the world.
And some people would say a healthy tension.
A healthy tension, but it never really got personal up until the last few years. I feel like more recently, in the last couple of years, we've had a lot of interruptions, almost insults exchanged between commissioners, between commission and staff. The public has taken notice. We had and there's all these other issues that we're going to get into involving zoning violations involving one commissioner in particular. Sure. So it got a little nastier. I was just looking at one of the more memorable meetings this year, which was Valentine's Day, February 14th, mm-hmm. and they were discussing affordable housing zone, and you just had these moments where a commissioner would speak for a long time, and he'd be interrupted, and there would be accusations of him not being prepared, mm-hmm. and then some other commissions would take offense and kind of basically saying, you're not going to convince us anyway, what's the point of discussing it? So it just got kind of off topic. It became mm-hmm. more of a personal kind of thing. But
aren't there rules of order in which people are supposed to actually hit their button and get the light on in order to be called on, and then they can speak? So is that out the window, or how is it that people are interrupting each other?
They just speak up. I mean, I should point out, it's not always that kind of atmosphere. They do have some issues that are completely not controversial and where it's orderly, and they do deep dives on things like parking studies, so they do function okay sometimes, but when it's bad, it gets really bad. Like this Valentine's Day meeting, I did a search for the word interrupt, and it appeared 80 times in the minutes.
Oh no.
So it's and even granting, maybe a dozen of them is somebody using the word interrupt, but mm-hmm. everything else is just them talking over each other and kind of interrupting each other. So I'd say it's gotten a little worse in maybe the last year or two.
Yeah. It seems like, the risk of incivility is always just outside the door for so many governing bodies. We've talked about this issue with the city council, not just in the last couple of years, but even back when I was covering land use, kind of early 2000s, and people are rolling their eyes at each other. It's not always a verbal interruption, and it seems like somehow, I don't know if it's cyclical, but there's some sort of restraints that some people need to abide by in order to be getting along with each other. And it's always interesting when kind of those restraints are taken off or discarded by some. And you do start to notice it affecting deliberations themselves. It's not just an unpleasant situation. It actually affects the work.
Right. It actually has to do, it affects what kind of recommendation they end up with, whether their colleagues support it, and how it gets delivered to the council. I mean, we had a situation at this affordable housing zone issue where we had the commission deliver two separate opinions. Instead of having one representative describe to the council what they did, you had three different commissioners, kind of the chair, somebody with one faction, and somebody from the minority opinion. They handed their own memo.
Yeah.
So the split is like way more obvious now than it's been in the past.
Yeah.
And it's becoming a campaign issue, which is one of the main reasons I wrote about it at this time, because unlike in the past when we had this healthy tension, we actually have council members calling for removal of a commissioner, or at least one council member. Others expressed some concerns about this commissioner, Michael Alchek, and then and we had many residents write letters about commission's conduct, testify publicly about it. Yeah. So it's kind of risen to the level where it was worth investigating what people are complaining about, to what extent are these allegations, do they have merit, and to what extent is it just political discourse manifesting itself in kind of the commission discourse. So. Yeah,
before we go, I do want to talk about Michael Alchek and the garage carport issue and conduct that people have pulled up. But Asher Waldfogel, you did an interview with him about the commission. Because I'm kind of curious if people, I know that some council members spoke with you about dysfunction and what they're seeing, but I'm kind of curious what it is like from the inside of the commission, if they recognize that there's friction and if they recognize that it's unhealthy, or if they have a different view of what's going on.
Well, they certainly recognize the friction because they're in the midst of it, and Asher Waldfogel is kind of, in a way, is a polar opposite of Michael Alchek. I mean, both ideologically and during interactions, I feel like they're almost like a protagonist-antagonist relationship, without naming one of them to either role, but they're often at kind of, get a little cross with each other. I think in the February meeting I referenced earlier, Michael Alchek suggested that they just move on with the issue because they're not going to convince each other anyway because they're so far apart. And Asher Waldfogel was kind of, he said he was almost offended by it. He said let's give it a chance, let's talk. So, but I think there is a realization that on many issues they're so far apart that there really will be no consensus. And when I talked to Asher, this was like about a month ago when I was writing about the Department of Transportation, I asked him about commission business. And he intimated that even though there are some strong personalities in the commission which helps fuel the clash, the nature of the commission as a purely advisory body also kind of contributes to the idea that commissioners stake out these extreme positions, knowing full well that these extreme positions are going to get watered down back at the council level. So why not kind of get out there? And so there's less incentive to compromise. And when there's less incentive to compromise, there's probably less incentive to be collegial. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think the philosophical take on what does a planning commissioner do, what's his or her role, I mean, that's been with the commission forever. People think commissioners are either experts at one or more areas and that they're just supposed to be there vetting projects, housing projects, transportation projects, and kind of giving the council their recommendation, or they think that they're actually supposed to be a unified body, or hopefully unified body, that can give, expert opinion and thoughtful recommendations, but ones that are more kind of collaborative than not.
Yeah, and also a third function I would say is as a public forum for residents to make their opinions felt before it gets to the council level. And so I think both of these functions still apply, but we haven't seen too much unifications for several years now.
So you were pointing out one issue, which was the affordable housing zoning, and that was actually delayed in part because of some disagreements over whether to proceed or how to make the recommendation.
They delayed it to the February meeting. They came back to it in March, and then they rejected it by a 4-3 vote.
Yeah.
Which the council then pretty much ignored their vote and passed it anyway.
Yeah.
Which is a whole other conversation about the waning influence of the commission. But
yeah. No, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was thinking about what Liz Niss had said about this July 25th discussion about the downtown development cap, saying that it was a peculiar vote.
Right.
Because it was out of sync with the direction that the council had actually given on the whole issue.
The council passed a policy by a 5-4 vote. It was a controversial policy.
Split. Mm-hmm.
Staff was trying to implement the policy by proposing an ordinance that would put this policy into place. And the Planning Commission just decided, we don't like this policy and it's too political, we shouldn't be handling it. Let's give it back to the council to deal with.
Yeah.
And so they punted it back. They rejected the staff recommendation. And that's what Mayor Niss was referring to when I asked her about it. She thought it was peculiar to have the council kind of say, this is what we want, and the commission just contradict them.
And we don't want that.
Yeah, she said it's not productive, I think, were her words.
Yeah, She also cited polarization as just kind of a general climate in the city right now. And I'm kind of curious, so polarization, I assume that she's talking about development, faster development versus slower development.
Yes.
She kind of intimated that people feel like they have to choose sides right now. Is that kind of how the commission is shaking out, that there are pretty strong ideologies on either side, or?
I feel like not every commissioner is really ideological, but I think when you have a few commissioners who are, it kind of forces the rest to get pulled like magnets into their orbits. Like, I don't think Ed Lowing is particularly ideological. I mean, it's like, when he came into the commission, I would have no idea where he stands on land use. I mean, he was a pretty collegial like manager of meetings. He chaired meetings. I think Shimag Gardias, he's been on there for many years. I couldn't tell you whether he's slow growth or whether he's pro-growth or whatever. I mean, I feel like he's a pretty independent thinker. But I feel like when you have the current makeup of the commission, where one commissioner is kind of pretty strongly pro-growth, and you have a few others, I would say Doria Suma and Asher Wolfvogel have been pretty conservative when it comes to adopting new policies that would allow more growth. The others kind of tend to gravitate towards either camp.
Yeah.
When you see a 4-3 vote, you kind of know who's going to be the 4 and who's going to be the 3 these days, even if not everybody is very strident in their positions.
Okay. And then the upcoming election for city council is kind of interesting in the way that it sort of influences whether or not the council can step in right now or would step in right now to address the fractious nature. And talk a little bit about that from what your reporting showed.
Well, a few people are uncomfortable with Michael Alchek, both for his behavior at meetings, interruptions, talking for a long time, the way he interacts with the public. That's what they told me. And also the garage issue. The
That's
fact
the elephant in the room.
Yeah, he was hit with 2 zoning violations last August by the planning department, by the very people who staff him at meetings. And I think what's more troubling for some is kind of the misleading nature of the way he constructed his 2 garages, which is strictly speaking legal, but it included what many perceive to be some deception. And if I could just explain it real briefly.
Right, go ahead.
Because, we did a PRA on this and we have a lot of information, but it's a long story. But anyway, in 2015, he wanted to build garages at two buildings in Duvnik, St. Francis neighborhood. The law did not allow garages because most houses on the block had garages in the back. He wanted them in the front. So instead of building garages in the front, he built carports in the front. And at the time, he actually emailed the city, and he was very clear that we're just constructing a carport. To be clear now, we are constructing with a carport. That's his words in an email. And then comes 2017. The city conducts its final inspections on the homes. And the following month, then Planning Director Hillary Gittleman informs the council that Commissioner Alchek, basically immediately after the final inspection, the carports were converted to garages without benefits of permits.
Wow.
So he basically said, we're going to do carports. Then as soon as the inspections are done, he converts them to garages. The city comes back and says this is in violation. And he basically says, no, because of the carports, now most parking facilities are front-facing. So
because his 2 made the neighborhood pattern.
They changed the context, so now the garages now the garages are legal. And the city wanted to deny the garages because they just approved the carports so recently and they were assured there won't be garages. And then he lawyered up and basically said, this is the code, and they basically acquiesced, and he got his garages after this student notice violation. So
had he actually applied for a permit to convert them into garages after the inspection?
No.
Okay, so they became garages.
Yeah, according to Gittleman's, it's without the benefit of permits. So he was asked to remove the doors back to carports. Then he applied for permits. He got them last December. But the reason it's worth bringing up is just because it's becoming a campaign issue, and you could kind of cite the disruptive nature of things. You could chalk it up to ideology and stuff like that. But
just hearty disagreement.
Yeah, but wherever you stand on growth, slow growth, fast growth, it's very unusual to have a former commission chair get into a legal scuffle with his own staff, have lawyers kind of almost threaten to sue the city if they didn't approve these garages, which he initially intimated would not be built.
Yeah.
And this garage issue is why Tom Du Bois, the councilman, thinks Alchek should be removed. He thinks it's a big issue. And it doesn't help that last November the commission was revising this loophole to make garages and carports treated differently, precisely for this reason. And Alchek never mentioned that this is going on, and he participated in the discussion, which...
Right, so that was in November, and it wasn't until December that the city agreed to let him convert his carports into garages.
Yeah, so his failure to disclose or to recuse himself or anything like that, some people see that as a problem too.
Sure.
The council members he spoke to.
Sure, and Du Bois is, for the record, running for re-election. He along with Cory Wilbach, Vice Mayor Eric Philsith, community members as well. So yeah, I could see as how this would be an issue. So I also know that on Town Square, there's been a council watchdog, community member, Fred Ballon, who's been really after Alchek and really after the city to address Alchek's carport issue and then also some of his behavior. He's actually calling for Alchek to be, as you were saying, a campaign question for all candidates.
He's publicly asked for him to resign, obviously, and Alchek just countered. Like he actually at a public meeting addressed about I think this was the Valentine's Day meeting, one of my favorite meetings of the year. I think Alchek later basically said after Balin's comments that, as you can see, this is like a concerted campaign, and so he's basically couching it as a growth, no growth issue, kind of nothing to see here kind of thing.
Okay. You did reach out to Alchek for comment for this story.
Yeah. We had a long chat, but he didn't want to talk on the record, so I'm respecting that.
Okay, all right.
But he had his chance. He had numerous chances to talk about this.
Yeah. Do you think that the carport issue, when it was raised in public, has affected the commission's interworkings at all? Have you seen from other commissioners?
I don't believe so. I feel like they are pretty focused on the issue at hand on the agenda / expression of the ideological views, that I don't think they go down to that level of kind of PRAing each other's emails to staff and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I feel like this would be like next level of nastiness, which thankfully they haven't gotten to, but it's possible that the council will take that up.
Yeah. So you talked with Karen Holman as well. What was her suggestion for how do you address dysfunction on a board? Because it could be this board or it could be another board.
To her, she wasn't as kind of as explicit as Tom Du Bois about the Alchek carport situation, but she was very concerned about his behavior. That they both used the word disruptive to describe him, and she thinks it's a matter of training. Like she believes that the commission has become too preoccupied with expressing their worldview, as she said it, and not enough in talking about the actual zoning issues that they're supposed to review.
Well, she's known for getting into the deep details.
She's kind of known for both. I mean, she has a very clear ideological view, but she's also a former planning commissioner who knows the zoning code very well, who knows the comprehensive plan really well. She could recite pages from it, so she's both. And she told me her proudest moments was creating a buffer zone, which we can get into later, but we won't. But so yes, she says when she was on the commission, everybody had to read like 3 books on how to be proper planning commissioners, how to be concise, reach compromise, interact with the public, that kind of stuff. She believes that that's not happening anymore. That they're not getting enough training. They're each like 100+ pages, but under 200, so it's not too onerous. But she believes that they could really benefit from more training, and that's a big thing.
Yeah.
And Mayor Nis, who of course is on the opposite side of the ideological spectrum from Karen Holman, but she also believes that the commission has become a little dysfunctional. She thinks it's time for the council to have a retreat and kind of talk about the commission's role and if it's time to change it
a retreat
anyway.
with the commission, or just a retreat by themselves to talk about the commission?
I think she with the commission. I think she's interested in knowing what they believe their function is. Is it to support the council or to support their view of the world, or both? She thinks, and they said that they would like more clarity from the council. So maybe everybody could use a kumbaya moment to come together.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for bringing us this topic. We can't leave this week.
I thank the commission. It was brought to me. Sorry.
We can't leave this week without talking about what happened on Monday night at City Council in regards to the citizens initiative that could have been placed on the November ballot to reduce the citywide office cap from 1.7 million square feet to 850,000. Could have been placed on the ballot, but what happened?
Oh, election night just got a lot more chill. So, yeah, the council had two options that 5 members didn't like either of them. Basically accept a petition from the citizens, which would basically lower how much office space the city could build between now and 2030 by half. Instead of 1.7 million square feet, it would reduce it to 850,000 square feet applied citywide. So that was the petition. It got enough votes to get on the ballot.
Signatures?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It got enough signatures to get on the November ballot. And then the council was preparing to place it, but then unexpectedly they decided to just adopt it and make it the law without any election.
That was pretty surprising for the council itself, it seemed.
It seemed like it. I mean, the swing vote was Corey Wolbeck, and you wouldn't expect him to vote with the 4 members who wanted to adopt it into law, but he did. It was basically Corey and the 4 residentialist, quote-unquote, members.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, because of that, it appeared to stun some of his usual colleagues who are more amenable to growth, like Liz voted for yes, no, everything for a second. There was a brief kind of double take.
Yeah, there was a little bit of technical difficulty.
Yeah, I got some
voting system.
I got some texts of surprise from council members I won't name, but it was a little shocking.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, as a result of this vote, there will not be a November election on this particular issue.
Yeah, the residentialists scored a win on this particular issue. So I think it was particularly surprising because there was a discussion about this before, and people were kind of lining up in their usual way to either put it on the ballot or at that time, or to study it more. And there was a study that came out. What did that conclude about the effects or the impacts of the citizen initiative?
Yeah, the study was very limited in scope. It just looked at the fiscal impacts. It did not look at traffic, quality of life, all the stuff that people like former Vice Mayor Greg Schmidt and other supporters of the petition talk about. But it concluded that in the short term, there won't be that much impact because there's still 850,000, although it's probably like 600,000 at this point because it dates back to 2015. So in the short term, not much impact. In the long term, there could be an impact of like about $1 million a year, but that's assuming there was going to be 1.7 million square feet of development, but now it's 850,000. So you're assuming that the city would kind of go towards the maximum build out.
Sure.
And in that case, there would be some impact, about $1 million per general fund. But it also knows that there might be some other kind of softer impacts, a chilling kind of effect on the business climate. Some businesses may not locate in Palo Alto because they wouldn't be able to expand because of the new cap. So those kinds of like softer impacts that it alludes to. And a lot of these points were made for interviews with Stanford Research Park people.
Oh, yeah.
And so they do have a horse in this race. So that's worth disclaiming.
Yeah.
But that was the
not
gist
to
of
get
it.
too deep into the impacts, I mean, wouldn't there have also been services that would have been needed had the full build out of 1.7 million square feet occurred?
Yeah, and that's why...
That would have cost the general fund.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's fees that every developer pays, for impact fees for things like libraries, public safety, parks, you name it. And so, yeah, there'll be fewer fees collected if there's less development,
but also fewer services used.
Yeah, I mean, they're impact fees, so if there's less impact, you don't need the fees as much.
Yes,
so,
exactly.
And I think Councilwoman Holman pointed out that impact fees usually don't cover the full impacts anyway. So, yeah, you have less money, but you also have less need of money. That's kind of the gist of it.
Yeah. So Corey Walbach, did he speak to his vote?
No, he did not. Which is surprising.
Why not?
For anybody who's watched Corey Walbach in the last 4 years, that was almost more shocking than his vote, is the fact that he didn't talk at all before the vote. Why he didn't speak, it's hard to tell. I know that I spoke to him, just chatted casually in the weeks before this vote, and he seemed undecided. And his point has always been, people could say what they want about pro-growth, anti-growth, but building more offices has never been his thing. He's hardcore into pro-housing. So if this was an initiative limiting housing, he'd be definitely against it. But he's saying this is consistent with his past statements about the fact that we don't need a lot more office, but we do need a lot more housing. So that's kind of his position.
So he's focused on that jobs housing imbalance, trying to bring that ratio down.
Yeah. And it just sounds like he didn't reach a decision until fairly close to the meeting, if not the actual meeting.
Okay.
Which, nothing nefarious about that, but it did surprise some people who are used to seeing him vote with his 4 normal allies and not the 4 who usually oppose him and who he'll be running against.
So this initiative was brought forward by Palo Altans for Sensible Zoning, that group, and spearheaded by former Vice Mayor Greg Schmid.
Who seems to be a lot more effective now that he's not on the council in changing city's policies.
Hey. He knows the temperature.
No, it's a big victory for him and Paz.
So I found it interesting that in some ways he's satisfied, but in one way he's not. He really wanted this issue to get its full airing.
Yeah, I mean, when he introduced the initiative, I mean, his whole talk was he wanted us to be like a Athenian-style democratic conversation where the community really gets to get into the issues. That's how he framed it anyway.
Well, that's him.
Yeah.
He loves to get into the issues.
He likes to get into de Tocqueville and that kind of stuff, which is great. But now that conversation is not going to happen because the council basically took the proposal that he gave and said, we're going to make it our law. So it's a victory, but you get a sense that he feels like it was almost too easy.
Cheated.
For all the hard work they put in gathering signatures. It's like...
Yeah. Well, I'm sure he can find another way to have this lively debate that he seeks about this issue.
We'll see. Not this election year, but maybe in the future.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much. We'll see what happens with these and other issues in the coming weeks.
Yes.
That wraps it up for this week's Behind the Headlines. If you like what you hear and see, you can click subscribe below or leave comments on this video. You can also go to paloaltoonline.com for all the latest news on Palo Alto, or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll see you next week.